Good morning. It is Wednesday at 9:30. This is Jason Dean here back at Film Fanatic headquarters. Thanks again for everyone checking out my videos. If you like this stuff, listening to me talk and rant about movies that I have a deep love for, please like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate all the awesome support. I did a show recently. I've been having these different ideas, constantly kind of brainstorming about some new ideas and trying some new things. And I just did a show on just strictly soundtracks and film scores. And and I tried to talk about how that stuff and that whole kind of world, that whole genre of filmmaking, a big aspect of filmmaking is, a real influence on me as far as the weird music that I compose for my band Quantum. We that's probably the biggest overall, on a scale from 0 to 100%. Like that's the biggest. That's probably at 100% level for me as far as an influence on the music that I write with Quantum. And it's and it's also it goes beyond just being a casual listener or a fan. It has a direct link to, the whole film scoring aspect has a direct influence on me for inspiration for my own writing for the band Quantum. But also I find it as personally, it's it affects me at a deep level, and it's something that I really it's a level that I kind of operate on. So I did a show where I just talked about all the great film scores and composers that I really love, and some films that really mean the world to me. And I made like kind of an informal list because there's, when you talk about lists and like the top 10, top 20 or top 50, that's a thing I think about a lot, but that's also pretty ambitious, and I find that that order can change a lot, but overall there's a general overall view of and certain tastes that I have, and also certain films and things that I just always go back to, and composers. So it was basically a show where I talked about all those things, and I had like an informal list of things that I always kind of go to. So I really appreciate people checking it out. It just went up to a little over 1,000 views, so very cool. And it's also my first experimentation with trying to use some music for some of the shows. I'm kind of moving into trying to get more into the production side of things. The next thing I'm going to be doing is trying to upload a lot of my own original music onto this channel for future videos, and also, to get into some visual things that I want to kind of present in some of these videos. So stay tuned for that. So it's a pretty new thing. It's pretty exciting, and it's a new venture, and I'm kind of learning as I go. But I really appreciate people's support, and so moving forward, look forward to those new things, and also there'll be some more interviews coming your way very soon. I have another interview scheduled on this Sunday coming up, or actually this Saturday, with Ray Leone, who's actually a drum student of mine who I've known for just about 6 or 7 months. And we had a discussion that was kind of outside of our usual topic of things that we talk about, music related things. And I was telling him about my love of film, and that I have these pages that I have, and this new YouTube channel is a very new venture. And I've been, concentrating on that, as making that, like, as far as my love of film, I'm trying to make this channel my priority, and get it as good as I can, and upload lots of hopefully cool videos, and try new things. And I've been telling them about I started doing these interview segments, and everything is more or less concentrated on horror films, particularly the grindhouse genre. And Ray had told me that during our conversation that he's had a lot of experience actually being an actor in a lot of like independent horror films, like super low budget films. And I was like totally surprised, because Ray is a very charismatic charismatic person. He's got this amazing, like kind of larger than life personality. He's got all these amazing stories. He's a super cool guy. And we just kind of met, and I found out that he, has all this experience as an actor, as an extra in various low budget films, and also he's done some lead roles. And I remember looking up, he gave me a list of some of the films that he's worked on, and I spent some time looking through. I tracked a lot of the stuff down, a lot of the films and projects he had been involved with the last few years were online and mostly on YouTube, so I was able to find a lot of these things, and I was hooked right away. I was like, this is great, and it really reminded me. And I mentioned this in a previous show way back when, but the couple of the films that I had been involved in really reminded me of this amazing movie called Suburban Sasquatch that I did a show on about a month ago, which is a horror film that's kind of shot on video, and it's transferred to the digital format. And there's this whole like kind of subgenre, and I kind of consider it also like a modern day kind of grindhouse film. And it was, only from a few years back that movie came out, Suburban Sasquatch. And it was like, so when I watched his films, it just totally reminded me of that kind of style of filmmaking. Super raw, super low budget, super cheesy, but also amazing at the same time. So he's going to be Ray Leone is going to be a guest on Film Fanatic, and we're going to be filming our next interview, or our first interview, on Saturday. So stay tuned for that, and I'm really excited about that because there'll be, aside from his film experience, he's got a lot of amazing stories. He's worked in all different kinds of facets of different careers, and very cool guy. So I'm excited about that, and also I will be still trying to schedule the actress that I still haven't announced yet, who is part of the Friday the 13th franchise. The biggest conflict around that, we were going to be doing an interview about, it was probably around Halloween time, early November. We were like getting close to actually nailing down a time to schedule that interview. But it's been hard with schedule-wise, mostly on her end. She's a very busy person, so we've had to move that date. We had to kind of cancel it and move it around, but we're still in contact, and we're looking to still set that up, around the holidays or a little bit after. So stay tuned for that. I'm gonna, try to keep that as a real potential for an interview. I think it'll be fantastic. So stay tuned for that. And some other news that's, of other things that we're doing here in the Film Fanatic camp. We're going to be having our first Film Fanatic event, and that's going to be coming up in December, in a couple of weeks, actually. And that's going to be the first, I guess, if you want to call it the first, like, kind of official event that I'll be hosting that's put on by Film Fanatic. And it's basically going to be a live movie watching event / party. More of an excuse to have a party, but I'm basically going to I've been inviting some friends and some people that I know, and we're going to have a watch party, and we're going to watch Freddy vs. Jason. Such an awesome movie, and it's a great cap off to that amazing franchise. And it's, I think the last big thing that came out of the franchise, or everything that's been tied to Friday 13th, it was that movie. I feel Freddy vs. Jason, which I think is an awesome movie, and then also the reboot that came out about 10 or 12 years ago. Those are the last two things that kind of happened in that world as far as new releases. And so it was recently announced that there's going to be more films. That whole franchise was really bogged down and marred down by all kinds of legal issues and copyright issues and courtroom battles, and things have kind of settled. The dust has kind of settled, so now there's going to be more movies eventually coming our way, thankfully. when that was announced, that kind of really, made me excited, and I got this whole idea to make this whole series, create this whole series where I covered all of the movies that are on, that are a part of the mythology of and the world of Friday 13th. So I was thinking of new things to kind of cap off that whole kind of event. So one was doing this big interview that I've been in contact with one of the actresses, which is something I'm still working on. And then the other one was to do this live event. We're going to have a party, a watch party. We're basically going to have a party where we're going to watch for Freddy vs. Jason. And I'm going to record it for for a future release here up on the channel. I think it'll be fun. The whole premise is basically, to watch the movie, hang out, and get people's reactions. And I know some folks that say they're coming haven't even seen this movie and aren't even really horror movie fans per se, so it'll be interesting. I have a lot of friends who know that I love movies, obviously, and I have some friends that are fellow film fanatics to a degree, but we, the majority of people that I know and friends that I know aren't really into like slasher films. That people have a lot of things against, like the gore aspect and whatnot, and I get that, and that's fine. So it will be an interesting turn of events, how to see how this whole thing works out. But it'll be a fun excuse to get together and have a little party. So it'll be the first event centered around film, and it'll be the first event that I'm putting together under that name. Originally, I was going to try to do something else, in a different location in Belfast, but it kind of didn't work out, and I felt like this might be a better way to go and a little bit more informal and just easier to do. So stay tuned for that, and it should be a hoot. It should be fun. And then the other event that I have coming up, which we just booked, is I have another Quantum show coming up in January, and it's going to actually be on. Now that I say it, it's going to be on Friday the 13th, which is pretty funny and ironic, since now I'm talking everything. I'm talking all about Friday 13th again, which is, again, my favorite horror movie franchise. So we're going to be doing a show with Quantum and my really great friend Tom Luther, who is one of the most amazing people I know, one of the most incredible and gifted musicians I know. And I've been fortunate enough to work with him over the years in various, combinations of different groups, some of his own projects, and then some other groups that he was a part of. Just an amazing person, and I always look up to him in a lot of ways, and he's always been a big source of inspiration. And he's always had a real deep love and affinity for electronic music. In the last year or two, he created this newer project called Sphere Music, and it's definitely in the kind of the ambient world, but it has also, grooves and beats and drums, and it also has, a little bit of a jazz influence, but it's definitely like kind of atmospheric ambient music. Amazing stuff. So we're going to be doing a show together at the Poor Farm in January on Friday 13th. So stay tuned for that. Really excited. We played a show together. We did a couple of things together over the last 2 years. We did a show, Quantum and Sphere Music did a show at the Poor Farm, and this show is going to be at the Poor Farm in Union, Maine, which is an awesome brew pub that I've played there quite a few times over the years and been trying to do more original-based kinds of shows there. We did a show there last summer with Quantum and Sphere Music. We did a show at the Poor Farm, and it was pretty awesome, and it was super fun. This will be a little bit of a different thing because we'll have to be inside, and it's not summertime, but I don't know, I think it could be fun. The last show we did, there was a huge amount of people there. It was pretty wild and crazy, and it was summertime. I think it was in June, so it was, he was amazing, and it was I felt like it was a really great pairing of music and styles. And the summer before that, Tom had put together a two or 3 day music festival, and basically it was all centered on kind of eclectic music, mostly on the electronic side of things. And he had gotten Quantum to play at one of the days of the festivals. of the festival, and that was really great. So that was like kind of our first time kind of collaborating that way. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Really excited about that. So there'll be a bunch of promotion for that in the next couple days or a couple weeks. So stay tuned. So this brings me to a big show that I've been wanting to get to, and also one of my favorite directors. And I feel like in the context of horror and gore movies, and also obviously exploitation, if you're a fan of exploitation, horror films, grindhouse films, and overall, I think if you're a fan of horror movies in general, this movie, Blood Feast, directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, the legend that he was, this movie is kind of arguably looked at as being more or less the first movie that introduced, you know, elements of gore in a film. It came out in 1963, which is amazing. And this film is kind of regarded as like pretty much the first movie that showed like copious amounts of gore and violence and practical effects on the big screen. I mean, so like, even from the perspective of being a fan, like if you're, into say modern day films, and maybe you've checked out films from the 60s or say films from the 70s or 80s, or if you're a product of the 80s like I am, you have a little bit of perspective on, this beloved genre, like kind of where it came from. And like for me, and I know there's a lot of other folks out there, if you discover a certain style of filmmaking or a certain style or a certain particular genre, and also for me, it's the same thing. It could be the same with, say, art, or maybe a certain style of writing. And particularly, another example would be music. You discover like a genre or something that you really love, or you naturally gravitate towards. And if you get really into it, you tend to, you might dig into the deep vaults, like you might, take a deep dive and see maybe, where that style kind of came from, or, where the whole, you know, origins came from. Like one example I can think of is like, say, you know, one style of music that I really got into and that I still love, or one of my favorite bands, is Massive Attack. And they were kind of looked at as like this purveyor of a kind of a new sound and a new style, and it was kind of referred to as like trip hop. And basically, it's a British style of music where they used elements of, reggae, hip hop, electronic music, house music, techno, and rock. So they were looked at as being, one of the pioneers of that sound. Other bands that came out of that school, like Portishead and things like that. So like I really loved those guys growing up, and I still love them. They're still one of my favorite bands. So that style became a known, or almost like a household style, because of those bands. And there was tons of other bands that style went on to influence, and even to this day, the whole like kind of trip hop kind of thing. And now we have like different variants of that, like uh, stuff like trap music and whatnot, and all of those things kind of came from this camp. So like as a fan, what I would do, and typically what I end up doing, is like I discover a band like, say, Massive Attack, and I'll like check out stuff that they loved, or that music that they influenced, and then I'll like go back even further. It will like bring me back to older records or bands that were maybe kind of doing that style, or maybe it could be a combination of certain artists that kind of helped mold that sound and moved it into the foreground, and had a real key role in shaping more of a modern, contextual sound, like say Massive Attack. Groups like Goldie and things like that, where they were kind of doing it even before them, and they were incorporating elements of electronic music, reggae, hip hop, and it went on to influence the sound. So I look at that like, say, with horror movies, like you take a movie like, say, Hereditary, for instance, which is a more of a modern film, which I really love, by directed by Ari Aster. And it's a very intense movie, and there's a lot of gore, and there's some shocking scenes in it. So like I would, typically look back to see, well, I wonder what like films maybe influenced Ari Aster, the director, and then trace it back, and the chances are it's films from the 70s and 80s, and then then I might discover films like say Friday the 13th, where like movies that I grew up on, but I'm like, oh wow, like this is where, and again, it's a different style, but as far as the inclusion of gore and the inclusion of violence and the overall narrative of horror, I'm like, okay, maybe that's kind of where that started, the early Friday the 13th movies. And then you take a deeper dive and you look into what influenced, say, Sean Cunningham, who is the director of Friday the 13th movie and launched the franchise. Check out movies that he loved, and then you trace it back to even further to where there were movies that came out in the 70s that really influenced him. Halloween in particular is the main one. And then you could take that and see what influenced John Carpenter and other movies that kind of might have influenced the whole kind of slasher film, and then you trace it back further and further. So it's a real interesting kind of lineage. And I remember like tracing back, kind of the idea, the concept where certain horror films came from. And for a while, I thought, okay, it's a lot of this stuff came, and for that matter, a lot of directors that came out of Italy and Europe, in the 70s and 80s were doing the whole gore thing, the whole kind of slasher thing, and the whole exploitation thing before a lot of American films. So I like traced it back to that. Dario Argento, Bruno Mattei, Lucio Fulci, who I've talked a lot about, kind of was like, oh, this is where, I have a deep love of horror, so I want to, go down that rabbit hole and see maybe where the origins came from. So I'm like, oh, okay, a movie like House by the Cemetery or The Gates of Hell, all directed by Lucio Fulci. These were maybe like the first movies that came out in the 70s and early 80s, where they, they showed copious amounts of violence. They had the whole like kind of exploitation thing going on, and elements of like the slasher film. The whole giallo thing was really influential. And then when I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis a few years back, I realized, oh wow, if I trace it back even further, he was kind of doing that whole kind of thing even before a lot of these Italian directors. So then that takes you back to even further to like to the 60s. And it's such a cool, like, interesting kind of lineage and way of discovering new artists, new films, new directors. I think it's like an exciting way to be turned on to all new, all these new worlds. And Blood Feast came out in 1963, which is, and to me, it's just amazing. Like my first introduction to Herschel Gordon Lewis was a few years back, and that being said, he's gone on to become, he's one of my favorite directors, and in some schools, like people would not really consider him to be a director because he's a pure like exploitation director. He never really took himself seriously as a highbrow or as a serious director per se, compared to say someone like Stanley Kubrick or Steven Spielberg. It's a whole different style of making films. But I feel like after I have like pretty much have all of his films. I pretty much own all of Herschel Gordon Lewis's films on Blu-ray now, and he's emerged as one of my favorite directors. I just can't get enough of his work. But he came out of the exploitation world, and typically a lot of these films had zero budget, and he just cranked out movies left and right. So prolific. He was notorious for doing one or two takes. The other thing that he did which I thought was fascinating, was he also like scored a lot of his own films. Like this movie in particular, Blood Feast. He scored he scored his own movie, and a lot of, nobody was really doing it then. and he came out of the ad world. He was a guy who came before he got into film. He was working for different companies, and he worked in the advertisement industry. So he had a real knack for his background was how to market products, and that gave rise to when he got involved in filmmaking. He he started collaborating with his producer David Friedman, and David Friedman was a producer, and he had worked basically in the like sex exploitation and before the sex exploitation world. He worked in the porn industry. Herschel Gordon Lewis and David Friedman started collaborating, and they had this really long lasting partnership and collaboration where they put out all of these great exploitation movies. So they really combined forces, and with Herschel Gordon Lewis's background as being, a marketing strategist, and his whole thing was about advertisement and promotional. They kind of gave rise to the whole like kind of exploitation world because they were doing so many films, they were putting out so much content for such little money. And the films are super sleazy. They had the background with William Friedman having his background as a producer, a producer in all of these sex movies basically, and then he moved into that more exploitation world where they started using actors, if you want to call them actors, and trying to conceive these stories, and then they collaborated. So they combine all these elements with the low budget nature, the real sleazy nature, and then also the whole gore. Eventually, the gore horror film aspect came into play. And they were, this movie is, one of the first films, if not the first movie that I know of that is considered a gore film or a splatter film, where they use, these really horrible, just incredibly cheesy practical effects, but they're effective, and it's so bad. It's truly the case of it's so bad it's good. I think. And Herschel Gordon Lewis never took himself seriously. He came from and had the perspective that there was an audience during this time. This was the time of the grindhouse and the grindhouse world, and when people would go to movies, to go to actual theaters and drive-throughs, and there was the time where that was what people did, and there was a core audience that loved the exploitation world as far as sex exploitation or crime exploitation, and the horror exploitation world really exploded. And William Friedman and also Herschel Gordon Lewis realized that they have this audience that is kind of dedicated, and they have these expectations that they want to be satisfied as far as seeing copious amounts of violence and gore on the big screen. So they focused, their whole thing on trying to build that audience and basically manipulate that audience and milk it to make product. And that was really it. They didn't really have visions of, well, we're artists, we're trying to present, all of these social issues in our work. We're trying to, leave this grand legacy of films that will be looked at and regarded as pieces of art. No, they were in the exploitation world, pure and simple. They had this niche in the public that loved this trashy material, so they just milked it. But I feel like over time, they both made so many movies. In particular, Herschel Gordon Lewis directed so many movies. He eventually, I feel like, had his own style. And the minute that you see any of his films, you just know it's him. It just got this certain way of how he would put together a movie. He was notorious also for literally going up to people on the streets, strangers, and throwing them in the film with no acting ability whatsoever. I mean, just amazing. And doing things for, just a few $1,000s, as far as the budget goes. But to me, it just adds to the charm and the, on one hand, I feel like he took his craft, you want to call it a craft. I think on one hand he took it seriously, but then on the other hand, he didn't really know what he was doing. He didn't really know how to, properly set up a shot or how to properly get the performance from an actor. But he was excited about doing it, and he, wanted to turn out as much material as he can. So I feel like that energy is infectious when you watch his films, and you can kind of see that. And there's still, and I feel like even though it's, on some levels it's so poorly done, there's a lot of love and there's a lot of care put into these films, and they're just super entertaining as hell. Like they're just really entertaining. So, and he, over time, I feel like he definitely had an influence, without a doubt, on many filmmakers. And Blood Feast was one of his biggest movies. Like this was actually kind of a commercial hit back then, which is wild. And from a historical context, like I said, this was pretty much the first movie. If you like horror films and you're interested to see and finding out how or where the style or the genre kind of was created, this is kind of where it started, like more or less, as far as seeing, gore on the screen and copious amounts of violence. Like this is kind of where it started, and to think that this, started this that this film came out in 1963 is just mind-boggling. The first time I saw this, I bought this. I should go back a little bit. I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis about 5 years ago or so. I had never heard of any of his films, and I randomly, I'd gone to Opera House Video in Belfast, which the beloved local video store, and they have a pretty good selection of a lot of B movies and various combo packs of exploitation movies. Like they have actually a pretty good selection. You have to look around a little bit because they mostly specialize in traditional films or Hollywood-based kinds of films. But if you look around and take a little extra time, they have quite a few of these kinds of films, which is really cool. And I've noticed that over the last couple of years when I take a little more time to kind of dig into some of the shelves, and I've been really amazed by a lot of the films that they have. Like they have some Herschel Gordon Lewis films and quite a bit of Lucio Fulci films and various other things. So, but this one time I went in there, they had a collection where it was basically like 6 or 7 discs together, and it was like $2, and it was basically a whole like set of all of these weird, obscure, exploitation grindhouse movies. And I remember I bought it or rented it, and one of the movies they had on there was 1000 Maniacs by Herschel Gordon Lewis, and I had never seen it before. I never heard of him as a director, and I just totally fell in love with it. Just how sleazy it was, how low budget it was, how just raw it was, and also like in its own way, it was kind of a disturbing movie. And but just overall, it was so entertaining. I was just totally into it, and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, so after that, I saw this film. I kind of fell in love with it. 1000 Maniacs, just such an awesome movie. I started doing some research and started checking out, like, who is this guy, Herschel Gordon Lewis? Like, this guy's like crazy. He's insane. Like, who is he? And I did some research and realized, like, wow, he's in the kind of the world of grindhouse, he's a pretty well respected person. And from that moment on, I kind of got obsessed. So I looked up all of his films that Herschel Gordon Lewis had directed, and I started compiling these lists. And I was just amazed by how many films there were, but then also tracing it back, like the lineage of the time period. I was like, wow, he was putting out all these films in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, and then also right up into the 90s. So he was so prolific and put out this huge body of work, and most of the the quote unquote genre that he worked in was the horror, gore, splatter style. So I was just like, oh, I got to check this guy out. So I made some lists, and I started reading about this movie, Blood Feast, and I'm like, wow, like I read about it for a while, and I was like, this looks super cool and amazing. And I went ahead and I got it, and I ordered it on Blu-ray. And when I got it, in the mail, I watched it. I was just completely blown away by it, and I was like, wow, like this is super gory. It's so terrible and just such a fun ride. But I was taken back by how gory the film is. It's got this kind of legendary scene where a woman has her tongue ripped out of her head, and they use this like a real cow tongue, and it's so gory and so cheesy, but it's like kind of shocking. And I was like, wow, like this came out in 1963, like, and it just blew my mind that this kind of thing was happening in this early 60s, and just so like even predating the time of where people were still, it was before kind of the social revolution kind of happened. It was right at the beginning of that. So it just blew my mind away that this was like a thing back then. And I'm like, wow, like so this gore thing, it just opened up this whole thing in my head about, I grew up watching the Friday 13th movies thinking, oh, okay, this is like where that thing started. And then, gradually, you know, got more into seeing where, a lot of Italian directors were doing this kind of thing before that film about by 10 years or so. And, with all the Giallo films. And then when I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis, I was like, wow, like he was doing this even before, any of these other directors were making these great films. And I was just like completely blown away by it. So then I got totally obsessed. So I bought most of his films. I have most of them on Blu-ray, and the packaging of his films are just astounding. Like they come with a bunch of bonus features that are just some of the best I've ever seen. They and it's by a company called Arrow. Arrow is one of those other companies that is definitely one of the best companies that specializes in remastering and repackaging all of these grindhouse classics. And they give you your money's worth. I mean, there's two discs. There's a few other films on here that they're one in particular, Scum of the Earth, which is one of his earlier films, which is like a pure like kind of sleazy exploitation movie, and it's super awesome. And that came out in the 50s, and so it's amazing that like he was doing this kind of work for so long and before anyone else. So if you're a fan of horror, and particularly if you're a fan of like slasher films or gore films, like this is kind of where it started. Like this is the bedrock, and kind of where this whole crazy genre started. So whether or not you can regard, or whether or not people or critics regard him as like say a filmmaker, because he wasn't really a filmmaker. Like he didn't really know what he was doing, but I kind of feel he had ambition and drive and focus and passion, and it shows in his films to such a high degree that I regard him as a filmmaker. And he had a particular style, very much so. He had his own kind of imprint and his own DNA in each of these films. So like I regard him as as a really important integral figure in the world of horror. In some ways, almost the most important figure, because he's spearheaded this whole genre way before anyone else, and it's amazing. I remember seeing an interview where with Stephen King fairly recently, and they were doing like a the interviewer was asking Stephen King's about various horror subgenres, and also about certain filmmakers that maybe came before him, or certain writers, and he went off on this tangent about Herschel Gordon Lewis, and he just totally kind of trashed him, and it was very disappointing that he like. It's one thing to not take him seriously. Like I understand, because he didn't take himself that seriously in a lot of ways, but he definitely left his mark, and I felt like Stephen King's perspective was pretty ignorant, and you know, uh, you know, and he really refused to kind of admit that. Well, at least Herschel Gordon Lewis like has a legacy, and he's got this core base of rabid fans like myself included, And when it comes to horror, he had these elements going on in his films before anyone else. So that's whether or not you regard him as a filmmaker, in like some kind of legitimate light, that to me commands respect. So I felt that was really a real disappointing thing to see someone like Stephen King's say. But anyway, this is just an amazing film. Herschel Gordon Lewis is the man. Many many films to his collection. I have most of them. I will be doing more of his films in the future. Definitely, I have most of them on Blu-ray, and they all come in Arrow. Like I said, is the company that's put out all of his films, and just fabulous. The packaging is just probably the best as far as like my collection of exploitation movies and the horror B movie subgenre, and even like the giallo movies. I've been buying a lot of the Italian horror films. This series of all of the Arrow put out of the Herschel Gordon Lewis movies are definitely the best ones, because you get, I mean, the prices are not, it was like 19 or 20 bucks. And I bought it brand new, which is a really amazing price. But you get so much bang for your buck. Like, they load it with hours of special features. They throw in even more obscure films on a lot of his discs. Each disc has about 3 films on it, this one included. There's like interviews. There's a really great interview with Herschel Gordon Lewis and Dave Friedman, because they had a falling out at one point in their career, and then they kind of reconnected. But there's a really great interview with them from the 80s that's just super interesting and hilarious. And there's interviews with various other people that worked on his films. Another film that I really love of his a lot. This is probably my favorite Herschel Gordon Lewis film, but another film of his is The Wizard of Gore. I love that movie so much. That's such an awesome movie. I really love 1000 Maniacs too. Like, those are probably my 3 go-to movies. But this movie is like the ultimate. It's super sleazy, super gory, utterly ridiculous and terrible, but just amazing. So yeah, Herschel Gordon Lewis is the man. So if you get a chance, please check him out. If you're a fan of horror and you have a little bit of an open mind, and you want to have an experience of where you're going to just have a really good freaking time, check him out. So this is Jason Dean, Film Fanatic. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my page, and we will see you next time. Peace.